lying awake in the dark. Tonight, you might be experiencing a cold, paralyzing numbness that feels as though the vital creative currents of your life have turned to solid stone. There is a terrifying quietness inside your thoughts, a heavy, stagnant weight that tells you your inner inspiration, your baseline capacity to feel deeply or create beautifully has permanently died out. You look into the center of your chest and find an empty, dusty reservoir, and the mind immediately begins to panic, launching a ruthless campaign of self-criticism that blames you for your lack of productivity and labels your fatigue as a profound spiritual defect. Maybe you have spent days or months pretending to be vibrant, smiling while feeling completely hollow inside, while your thoughts run in a frantic loop, trying to manufacture a spark out of nothing but raw willpower. Dear friend, right now know that you are not broken, and the stillness you are running from is not a permanent failure of your soul. Tonight, we will not force your mind to become a brilliant beacon of creativity, nor will we demand that you invent a new meaning for your life from this bed. We are simply going to allow your presence to drop into a low, shaded stone flume at the bottom of a damp valley, where the scent of wet duckweed, bog iron, and cold, standing water creates a safe, quiet shelter for a spirit that has run completely dry. Let the immediate environment of your room adapt to this deeper, heavier rhythm of rest, noticing how the cool air against your face carries the earthy, grounded texture of a slow canyon night. There is no need to perform alertness here, and no hidden ledger is measuring how much useful work you accomplished before your head met the mattress. The heavy layers of your bedding hold you with a total, uncritical weight, much like the ancient timbers of an old mill run, absorbing the cold dampness of a slow-moving stream without needing to change its direction. You are safe enough to soften the tight, defensive muscles around your temples, allowing your jaw to drop away from the heavy calculations of the day and letting your shoulders sink completely into the darkness. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the cool, autumn-tinged air fill the bottom of your ribs without forcing a perfect, symmetrical count, and let it pass through your lips like a long, soft sigh. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight, and you do not need to earn your right to rest by proving your value to the world before you close your eyes. The mind does not regain its luminous, creative flow by violently attacking its own periods of stillness or by using a lifetime of shame to try and whip a tired heart into immediate production. True inner transformation begins with a surprising insight from Buddhist wisdom. This cold, internal numbness is not an absence of your life force, but a protective, natural pause designed to keep your spirit from burning out against the demands of a relentless world. We live under the painful illusion that to be worthy, we must remain in a state of constant, high-energy rotation, continuously grinding out achievements, ideas, and emotional warmth for others to consume. But the great paradox of your stagnation is that your hyper-vigilant effort to force inspiration back into your life through sheer control is the exact mechanism that jams the wheel. Stagnation is not proof that you're an empty shell. Sometimes it is fear, pretending to protect you from a deeper exhaustion by freezing the gears before they break. You can care deeply about your path without turning your current emptiness into a permanent verdict on your worth. And if it feels right, you can let the struggle drop for a few hours, allowing your awareness to wander down into a misty canyon where an ancient wheel is waiting in the dark, deep within a shaded valley where the cliffs rose high enough to shut out the direct heat of the noon sun. There was an abandoned stone flume known to the local villagers as the place of the static wood. Morphi. At the bottom of this moss-covered channel sat a massive, centuries-old waterwheel, constructed from heavy slabs of waterlogged mountain oak and bound together by thick bands of pitted black iron. This great wheel had once turned the massive grindstones of the valley temple, but after a long parching summer, it had become jammed completely solid by caked river clay, baked silt, and thick, tangled mats of dry marsh reeds that had hardened like mortar between the blades. The stream that fed the mill run had shriveled into a shallow, sluggish trickle, barely wetting the bottom of the stone flume, leaving the massive structure to sit entirely inert under the dark shade of the cedar tree. A young temple carpenter named Taku had recently been given the care of the valley mill, and the sight of the unmoving wood filled his chest with a sharp, burning anxiety. He viewed the water wheel's stagnation as a direct, public reflection of his own incompetence, a shameful sign that the temple's vital energies were dying under his watch, driven by a frantic, sleepless need to prove his capability to the elders. Taku had spent 3 consecutive nights down in the damp canyon mud, refusing to rest his aching bones while the mechanism remained frozen. He had brought a heavy, forged iron crowbar from the forge, its surface cold and unyielding, and he was determined to pry the massive wheel into motion by sheer physical leverage. By the dim blue light of a low midnight moon, the young artisan would jam the blunt tip of the iron bar deep into the central axle gears, throwing his entire body weight against the handle until his breath was ragged and his palms were torn and bleeding. He would lift, push, and strain against the ancient oak, his muscles locking into a rigid grid of absolute effort. But the wheel did not yield a single millimeter. The only result of his violent leverage was a low, agonizing groan from the waterlogged wood as the iron teeth bit too deeply into the grain, splintering the edges of the ancient blades and digging the caked mud even further into the mechanism. The air around him smelled of bruised moss and old iron rust, and the more frantically he pried, the more exhausted his spine became, until he was completely blind to everything but the weight of his own failure. As the cold mist began to drift off the standing pools of water in the flume, a slow, unhurried presence moved along the wet stone ledge above the wheel. Sister Jinko, the old, blind mill keeper who had lived in the lower valley for 50 winters, walked down the slippery wooden steps without the aid of a lantern, navigating the dark solely by the texture of the moss beneath her straw sandals. Her skin was lined like the bark of the cedar trees, and her ears possessed the rare, quiet capacity to read the weight of the valley water by its sound alone. She did not carry tools, and she did not offer a loud greeting. She simply stepped into the shallow mud of the flume, her faded blue robes rustling softly against the ferns, and walked toward the place where Taku stood trembling with rage and fatigue. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter. The blind elder did not move to touch the iron crowbar, nor did she look into the young carpenter's face with judgment. She walked directly to the side of the massive, static water wheel and gently rested her bare, weathered palm against the rough, wet grain of the central oak axle. listening to the vibration of the wood with her entire body. Why do you spend the hours, meant for sleep, attempting to force the wheel against a stream that has not yet risen, Taku? She asked softly, her voice carrying the slow, damp cadence of water dripping from a cavern ceiling. You believe that this stillness is an enemy you must defeat with your iron bar, but your violent levering is only wounding the timber. Drop the iron, young builder, and feel what the valley is actually asking of you when the water is low. And this is where the mind begins to soften. The cold vibration of the forged iron crowbar seemed to travel directly up through Takus' raw, blistered palms, anchoring his entire weight to the frozen stillness of the valley flume. His knuckles were white, locked around the dark metal handle, with an unyielding intensity that matched the stubbornness of the jammed oak wheel before him. The echo of Sister Jinko's voice lingered in the damp night air, hanging low over the standing pools of bog-iron water like the thick grey mist that refused to rise from the canyon floor. Taku did not immediately loosen his grip. He stood knee-deep in the cold, sticky river silt, his chest heaving with a shallow, ragged rhythm that disturbed the quiet surface of the waterlogged canyon. A wave of heavy, unvoiced frustration surged through his veins, the familiar, exhausting irritation of a mind that treats its own stillness as a catastrophic barrier to be destroyed by force. The blind elder did not step back from his silent rage, nor did she attempt to gently pull the iron tool from his bleeding hands. She remained perfectly stationary on the wet stone ledge, her face tilted slightly toward the sluggish trickle of the stream, listening to the deep structural groans of the timber. The canyon around them was completely dark, save for the pale filtered moonlight that managed to slip through the dense canopy of cedar branches, casting long, liquid shadows across the encrusted mud and the tangled mats of dry marsh reeds that held the great wheel captive. The sensory world of the flume felt incredibly close, heavy with the smell of decomposing autumn leaves, the sharp tang of stagnant iron water, and the wet, ancient coldness that rises only from earth that has never seen the sun. Taku tightened his fingers around the cold crowbar, his shoulders tightening as he spoke into the shadow. If the wheel does not turn before the autumn rains arrive, elder, the oak will rot under the weight of this stagnant mud, he whispered, his voice cracking with the strain of his own hidden terror. The elders trust me to keep the grain moving. They trust me to maintain the life of the valley. If I sit here and allow this mechanism to remain frozen, I am nothing but an empty shell, a useless craftsman who let the temple's vital power dry up under his watch. I must force it. I have to break through this crust, even if it splits my own spine to do it. Sister Jinko slowly descended the last wooden step, her straw sandals making a soft, squelching sound as they sank into the edge of the river silt. She walked by touch, her hand sliding along the wet limestone wall of the flume, until she stood directly beside the young carpenter. She reached out and placed her palm not upon the wood of the wheel, but directly onto the cold, hard surface of the forged iron crowbar, right between Takus' trembling hands. The contrast was immense. His skin was burning with the fever of his own frantic exertion, while the metal tool was freezing, inert, and completely indifferent to his desperation. "Feel the iron, Taku," she murmured, her thumb tracing the rough, hammer-marked ridges of the forged bar. This tool was made to split granite and tear down walls. It knows nothing of the water, and it knows nothing of the wood. You have brought a weapon of absolute certainty into a valley that lives by the unmapped laws of the seasons. Tell me, what has this iron accomplished after 3 nights of your labor? Taku looked down at the point where the blunt tip of the crowbar was wedged deep between the massive oak axle gears. Under the immense, unyielding pressure of his leverage, the iron had not cleared away the caked clay or dissolved the tangled reeds. Instead, the hard, unyielding tip had dug directly into the grain of the ancient mountain timber, creating a deep, ragged gouge that split the wood open from the inside out. The delicate, hand-carved teeth of the gear assembly were splintering under the mechanical strain, their broken fragments falling silently into the grey mud below. In his desperate anxiety to force the wheel to perform its duty, his tool had only succeeded in compressing the dried silt into an even denser, rock-like obstruction, locking the mechanism into a permanent state of self-inflicted paralysis. The realization hit the young artisan like a sudden drop in temperature, a cold, striking clarity that made his hands loosen their grip on the iron handle. He stepped back, letting the heavy crowbar slip from his palms. It fell with a dull, splashing thud into the shallow mud of the flume, sinking instantly into the dark standing water until it was completely swallowed by the silt. Taku sank down onto a wet stone protrusion at the base of the flume, his arms hanging empty over his knees, his face hidden in his stained sleeves as the full weight of his exhaustion finally broke through his defensive posture. What happened next changed the way he understood suffering. He sat in the complete darkness of the canyon floor, his body shivering from the damp coldness of his wet robes, listening to the tiny, microscopic sound of the shallow creek trickling uselessly between the static wooden blades. For months, long before he had ever been given the keys to the valley mill, he had been living with this exact same internal warfare. Whenever a period of emotional numbness or creative dryness had settled over his life, his mind had automatically reached for that same iron crowbar of self-correction. He had spent his years treating his natural cycles of fatigue as an emergency, a shameful failure that had to be overcome by prying his mind into immediate, artificial production. He had used the sharp leverage of self-hatred to whip his stalled spirit into motion, completely blind to the reality that his frantic striving was the very thing splintering his inner resources and grinding the mud deeper into his heart. Sister Jinko did not offer him a phrase of empty reassurance, nor did she tell him that the water would rise tomorrow to solve his problem. She simply sat down beside him on the wet limestone ledge, her faded blue robes soaking up the dampness of the flume, her sightless eyes turned toward the unmoving waterwheel. The silence of the canyon was no longer an aggressive, threatening vacuum. It was an immense, non-judgmental space that held his failure without reacting to it. The old millkeeper reached out and pulled a loose, wet fern from the stone wall, rolling the damp leaf between her fingers until its wild green scent filled the small space between them. "The mud you are fighting is not an invading army, Taku," she said softly, her hand moving to touch the cracked, splintered edge of the wheel's lowest blade. "It is the very same earth that grew the oak trees for this frame. During the high floods of the spring, this silt was what balanced the current and kept the wheel from spinning so fast that the axle caught fire. Now, the stream has naturally run low, and the clay has dried to protect the wood from the winter frost. The wheel is not broken because it is stationary. It is simply resting in the landscape, waiting for the valley to breathe. Your iron bar cannot manufacture a river when the mountains are dry. Taku looked up through the dark mist, his eyes tracing the massive, static circle of the oaken iron wheel without the frantic momentum of his struggle to distort his vision. The structure no longer looked like a monument of his failure or a judge of his worth. It looked beautifully old, durable, and completely at home within the damp, shaded stillness of the canyon mill run. He saw that the caked clay between the blades was not a permanent corruption of the design, but a natural expression of the season, a temporary pause that did not require a violent latter night repair. He reached out with his bare, mud-stained fingers and gently touched the rough grain of the wood, letting his hand rest against the frozen axle without trying to force a single turn, allowing the immense silence of the flume to enter his bones. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter. The deep, unmoving shadow that settled over the ancient oak timber. When Taku finally let go of his iron bar is the exact same sanctuary that is waiting for your awareness right now within the quiet borders of your own room. As you lie here in the heavy stillness of the evening, letting the physical reality of your mattress receive the full, exhausted weight of your frame, let the cool, damp world of that canyon flume linger softly in your thoughts. This timeless insight is not telling us to stop feeling, nor is it an instruction to become a cold, indifferent statue that no longer cares about its purpose or its dreams. Buddhist wisdom is not asking you to abandon your creative spirit or to pretend that this heavy, paralyzing numbness doesn't feel deeply unsettling to a heart that longs to feel vibrant and alive. It is showing us something infinitely quieter. It is offering a pathway to an internal safety, where your baseline value is no longer held hostage by a relentless demand for continuous motion. When we look closely into the architecture of our overthinking tonight, we can begin to see that the most agonizing torment we experience never actually grows from the simple presence of our emotional dryness. The truest suffering lives entirely in the way the mind holds that dryness and the desperate, latter-night habit of treating a natural period of internal winter as a catastrophic failure of our own design. One of the greatest realizations of this path is the clear distinction between the first pain that life naturally brings to our environment and the second pain that our thoughts aggressively construct through their own resistance. The first pain is the raw reality of your current depletion, the undeniable fact that the mountain stream has run shallow, your internal reservoir feels empty, or your vital energy has reached a natural boundary that cannot be crossed by force. This first pain is like the caked river clay and the dried summer mud, the dried filling the spaces between the wooden blades of the waterwheel. It is a seasonal event, a neutral phase of a larger landscape that is simply waiting for the rains to return from the peaks. We cannot always control when our creative waters will run low, nor can we command our minds to manufacture brilliant insights when our physical form is crying out for a deep systemic pause. But the second pain, the suffocating, cold terror that keeps your mind pacing the floor of your room tonight, is entirely generated by your refusal to let the wheel be stationary. The second pain is what the mind adds when it stands over your numbness with an iron tool of self-correction violently, prying at the axle of your spirit and treating your need for stillness as a shameful crime. We drive a second wound into our own core every time we look at our internal emptiness and decide that our fatigue is proof that our inner light has permanently expired. We turn a temporary, protective deceleration into a permanent crisis of identity, telling ourselves a bitter story that we are uniquely hollow, broken, or left behind by the pace of the world. The suffering does not reside in the static wood or the cold standing water of the flume. The suffering lives entirely in our desperate effort to force a mill to grind grain when there is no current to turn the stones. Buddhist wisdom helps us translate these ancient mechanical habits into modern emotional language so that we can clearly see the hidden mechanisms of our own exhaustion. When we speak of attachment in this soft evening light, we are not talking about a healthy dedication to your craft. We are describing that tight, rigid contraction that says, I must remain productive, inspired, and continuously moving at all times, or I am completely worthless. It is a desperate craving for constant motion, an internal dictate that treats the natural, quiet ebb of your life force as an invading enemy that must be defeated with aggression. We believe that if we can just push through the numbness, if we can force our tired minds to perform competence perfectly enough, we can protect ourselves from the terrifying vulnerability of being empty, but trying to cure an internal winter by violently splintering the frozen wood of your own heart is a profound misunderstanding of true discipline. Impermanence, when felt within the safety of your own slow, unforced breathing tonight, is the gentle reminder that the caked mud currently locking your gears is not a solid, unalterable truth carved into your soul. This period of creative dryness is not a permanent destination. It is a passing configuration of the landscape, a temporary gathering of silt that has arrived to protect your sensitive resources from being warped by the friction of constant heat. You are not the mud, and you are not the blockage inside the flume. Your fundamental nature is like the wide, open canyon that contains both the rising flood and the static timber, an inherently luminous space that can hold the deepest winter stillness without ever being diminished or destroyed by it. Mindfulness in this quiet hour is simply your capacity to notice the cold weight of your own numbness without immediately reaching for the iron bar to attack your own thoughts. It is the ability to say, right now, the water is low, without turning that observation into a command to fix your whole life before the dawn breaks. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal. In a moment, this internal landscape will invite us into a soft physical choice where the body can learn how to exist alongside its own emptiness without turning that space into a battleground. True awareness is the deep, non-judgmental flume that can hold the static wood, the wet duckweed, and the cold bog iron water without becoming hard, rigid, or paralyzed itself. You are the space of the channel. You are not the jam in the gears. Compassion is the quiet courage to meet your internal stagnation, not with a demand for immediate transformation, but with the soft, weathered patience of the old millkeeper who rests her bare hand on the cold wood. It is the realization that you are fully permitted to let the waterwheel rest completely still in the dark mud tonight, allowing the shallow current to pass gently between your silent blades, without needing to grind a single ounce of grain to justify your place on the earth. You do not have to earn your right to be still, and you are safe enough to let the iron bar sink into the silt. Let your awareness slide gently away from the world of concepts and explanations now, drifting down into the immediate, living environment of your own physical form. As you rest here, in the quiet shadows of this evening. There is no requirement for you to master a specific meditative technique tonight, and no invisible monitor is evaluating how deeply or perfectly you can steady your attention in this hour. We are not setting out to repair your internal stagnation through a sudden, aggressive act of willpower, nor are we going to demand that you instantly clear the cold, grey silt of self-criticism from your thoughts. We are simply giving the heavy architecture of your body full permission to step off the burning wheel of constant striving and continuous production. Notice the unadorned, reliable pressure of your head against the surface beneath you, the slow settling of your hips, the weight of your limbs, and the spaces between your shoulder blades as they sink completely into the darkness. You do not have to hold up the structural weight of your entire life. Right now, the bed beneath you is entirely capable of absorbing your fatigue, your unvoiced panic, and your internal numbness without asking for a single word of justification. Take a slow, unhurried invitation to observe the simple arrival of your breathing, letting the air pass through your nostrils without forcing it into a rigid, artificial cadence. There is no special virtue in shaping your inhalation into a perfect symmetrical circle, nor do you need to expand your lungs until it causes a tight contraction beneath your ribs. If it feels right, you might simply notice the natural, cool widening of your chest, followed by the slow, effortless release that occurs when you choose to stop holding on to the air. With each quiet exhalation, you can let the outer boundary of your mind become just a little more spacious, like that ancient stone flume, opening its dark channels to the misty canyon outside, allowing the internal heat of your overthinking to find a natural, unforced equilibrium with the vast night air. There is no need to hurry this breath, and there is no penalty if your rhythm remains shallow or uneven. For a while, you are simply allowing your physical frame to breathe exactly as a dry winter tree breathes when the frost is on the bark. As you lie here in the stillness of your room, you may become aware of one particular thought, one recurring worry about being behind in life, or that heavy, cold sense of internal deadness that has been pacing the floor of your mind all evening. Do not try to violently push this numbness out of your attention, and do not judge yourself for carrying a deep, empty reservoir into your bed. Shaming yourself for feeling uninspired or hollow is only another way of picking up that heavy forged iron crowbar to frantically pry at the sensitive gears of your own heart, adding a fresh layer of internal friction to a spirit that is already profoundly tired. Instead, look at this familiar emotional pattern with a sense of soft, uncritical curiosity, as if you were observing a dark mat of summer, reeds resting quietly in a static channel. What does it actually feel like inside the physical borders of your body when this anxiety about your stagnation rises to the surface? Perhaps there is a tight, leaden knot in the center of your stomach, a heavy stiffness across your temples, or a cold contraction right behind your eyes. Even noticing these small physical markers is enough. You do not have to dissolve them or cure them to be safe in this darkness. If it feels right, you might imagine that the space inside your chest is like that wide, shaded stone flume at the bottom of the valley mill run. See the framework of your inner life, standing not as a frantic machine that must be continuously driven to grind out results, but as a massive, ancient structure of oak and iron that is completely permitted to be still tonight. For many years, your thoughts have been conducting a relentless midnight campaign. using the sharp leverage of self-blame to force your mind into an artificial state of inspiration. But right now, in the safety of this quiet room, you can let that internal iron bar drop completely into the silt. You can let the tool go. Imagine the mental weight of that heavy crowbar slipping from your hands, falling with a soft, distant splash into the dark standing water of the flume, and sinking down until it is entirely swallowed by the grey river mud. There is no elder standing in your doorway to inspect your progress, and nothing is required of you but to simply exist within the shadow of your own unforced presence. Take that heavy, exhausting worry about your creative numbness and place it gently into the static wooden blades of the water wheel resting in the dark channel. You are applying absolutely no emotional pressure to this blockage. Your attention is merely a cool, grounding draft that wraps around the ancient timbers, watching how the stone flume interacts with the weight. When the terrifying thought of being an empty shell moves through your awareness tonight, do not try to scrape away the caked clay, and do not try to force the mechanism to turn. Just let the stagnation rest inside the dark wood. Let the tension move completely outward, sliding down the sides of the massive wheel and settling into the non-reactive silt beneath you. Watch what happens to the density of your analysis paralysis when you give up the habit of fighting your own winter seasons. Without the hard, defensive walls of your resistance to bounce against, the sharp, stinging edge of your self-judgment begins to lose its definition in the dark. Imagine letting the image of the jammed wheel change very slowly now, not by prying it open, but by allowing a tiny, gentle trickle of pure mountain water to find its way through the canyon cliffs. This water is not a raging, violent flood designed to sweep the mud away by force. It is a soft, quiet stream that flows into the flume with the unhurried ease of starlight passing through cedar leaves. Watch how this clear current begins to pool softly around the base of the static wood, filling the tiny fissures in the dried river clay and gently soaking the caked silt without demanding any movement from the axle. Under the slow, persistent touch of this unforced awareness, the hard, rock-like crust of your perfectionism begins to soften naturally from the outside in. The dried marsh reeds do not need to be violently torn out. They simply begin to loosen their grip on the iron bands as the water dissolves the old, hardened density into a soft, neutral sediment that blends perfectly with the landscape. But the deeper lesson had not yet revealed itself, perhaps. You might realize that when you stop treating your emotional stagnation as an emergency, the empty spaces within your soul begin to transform their meaning on their own. The creative dryness is no longer a personal failure that you must correct through self-punishment. It is the very sanctuary that allows your spirit to touch the vast, undisturbed ground of awareness that holds all human exhaustion. By allowing your chest to remain soft and porous, like an old mill run that has ceased to fight its own mud, you let the residue of your difficult transitions pass completely through your awareness, without leaving a new scar behind. You can return to this soft, unforced touch. Whenever you are ready, there is no penalty if your mind tries to grab the iron crowbar again a few minutes from now, and no failure if the tight contraction returns to your throat. Each time the old anxiety rises, you can simply notice the tightness. Drop the bar into the silt and let the quiet current receive what your intellect cannot solve. Let the image of the valley flume dissolve very slowly now, fading back into the immediate. physical reality of your actual pillow and the dark, comforting safety of your room. The space around you remains entirely secure, and still the world outside continues its slow, unmonitored rotation through the night, completely unbothered by the complex ledgers of production we build in our thoughts to torture our hearts. You do not have to manufacture a single brilliant idea or discover your ultimate purpose before you are allowed to let your eyelids become heavy tonight. True transformation is not a distant shoreline that you must reach through desperate, exhausting effort. It is the cool, supportive depth of presence that has been cradling you all along, waiting for you to trust its stillness. And this is where the mind begins to settle into its own home. The slow transition of several weeks down within the moss-covered stone channel did not immediately dissolve Takus' internal unrest, nor did it instantly transform his relationship with his own stalled energy. Although he had dropped the heavy iron crowbar and allowed the metal tool to remain buried deep in the river silt, a subtler, more insidious form of resistance had begun to take root within his nightly habits. He had accepted that he could not force the massive oak waterwheel to turn by sheer structural leverage, but his mind could not stop treating the lack of motion as an ongoing crisis that required a clever internal manipulation. He would lie on his narrow woven mat in the carpenter's quarters, his chest tightening with the cold panic of feeling empty, while his thoughts designed an intricate new strategy to slick the mechanism. He remained terrified of the blank, unmapped space of his own numbness, and so he resolved to eliminate every trace of natural friction within the axle, believing that if he could make the components completely frictionless, the wheel would spin even under the weight of the shallowest trickle. On a late autumn evening, when the damp canyon air carried the sharp, bitter scent of decaying cedar needles and freezing mud, the young apprentice crept back into the lower depths of the flume. This time, he did not bring an aggressive weapon of iron instead. He carried a small, wicker basket filled with long, braided handfuls of dry flax, oil wicking, and a small clay jar of thick, unrefined rapeseed oil. His plan was born from a quiet, desperate perfectionism, the belief that if he could crawl into the dark, cramped axlewell beneath the floorboards and scrub away every microscopic patch of rust on the iron pins, he could grease the machine into a state of artificial readiness. He believed that his internal dryness could be managed if he just worked with enough meticulous, micromanaging discipline, keeping his hands so continuously occupied that he would never have to sit face-to-face with the empty silence of the mill, lowering himself into the narrow timber chamber directly beneath the center of the wheel. Taku was instantly enveloped by a heavy, suffocating darkness. The space was so confined that he could not stand. He was forced to kneel in the cold, stagnant water that pooled at the bottom of the masonry pit, his spine bent double beneath the massive, dripping curvature of the oak axle. The air inside the well was thick with the smell of old grease, bog iron rust, and the damp, organic rot of trapped river ferns. Holding a braided handful of the rough flax wicking, he dipped it into the thick oil and began to scrub the main iron bearing pin. With a frantic, rhythmic intensity, his arm moving back and forth in the dark like a piston driven by pure anxiety. As he worked, his mind filled with a frantic stream of critical commentary, and he treated every single one of those looping thoughts as an absolute, unshakable truth. The voice in his head insisted that he was fundamentally lazier than the other craftsmen, that his current lack of inspiration was a proof of a hollow character, and that, if the wheel remained stalled for another week, his entire life would be permanently ruined. He believed these mental judgments implicitly, allowing each negative thought to act as a direct command, to scrub harder, to press his bleeding knuckles deeper into the rough iron, and to push his body past its actual biological capacity. The pure friction of his desperate movements began to generate a dull, localized heat within the bearing, and the rough, dry fibers of the braided flax began to fray, tear, and splinter under the sheer violence of his pace. Instead of smoothing the mechanism, the unraveled flax fibers began to catch on the microscopic pits of the rusted iron, tearing away from his grip and bunching into thick, tangled knots inside the bearing socket. The dry wicking was absorbing the thick oil and combining with the old grit, creating a sticky, tar-like sludge that bound the iron pin even tighter into its wooden housing. Taku felt the mechanism grow heavier and more stubborn with every stroke. Yet, he refused to pause, his breathing becoming shallow, hot, and ragged as he strove to conquer the blockage. Through an act of sheer, muscular desperation, he was completely blind to the reality that his meticulous attempt to polish away the friction was the very thing manufacturing a tighter, more suffocating paralysis within the core of the machine. A soft, rhythmic sound began to vibrate through the floorboards above his head, the gentle, steady tapping of a long bamboo staff against the wet limestone ledges. Sister Jinko had come down into the mill house without her lantern, her acute hearing easily picking up the dry, scraping friction of Taka's hand working inside the subterranean chamber. She did not call down to him with an angry reprimand, nor did she order him to climb out of the pit. She simply knelt at the edge of the open hatchway, her faded blue robes pooling around the dark opening, and reached her bare arm down into the narrow shaft until her fingers gently touched the top of Taka's wet, tense head. Take a slow, quiet pause before you strike the next blow, young carpenter, the blind elder whispered, her voice carrying the cool, grounding stillness of the deep canyon night into the suffocating heat of the axle well. You have filled this dark hole with the smoke of your own judgment, and you are trying to grease a machine using the very fibers of your own exhaustion. Climb out into the air, Taku. The wood cannot learn how to breathe while you are burying it in torn flax. The young artisan froze in the dark, his fingers still tightly gripping the sticky, ruined braid of oil wicking. A sudden, deep wave of shame washed through his chest, followed immediately by an immense, shattering tiredness that seemed to unfasten the muscles along his ribs. He realized that he had spent the last 3 hours treating an imaginary catastrophe as an absolute reality, obeying an internal voice of fear that had lied to him about his own worth. Slowly, intentionally, he let his hand drop into the cold water at his knees, allowing the ruined flax to slip from his fingers. He climbed up through the narrow hatchway, his clothes stained with black grease and his face smeared with wet river mud, and sat down on the rough cedar floorboards of the mill house, his body trembling with a profound, unvarnished vulnerability. Sister Jinko did not move away from him, nor did she offer a single phrase of artificial comfort to soften the sting of his failure. She reached into his small wicker basket, took out a single, fresh strand of the unbraided flax, and laid it softly across his bare, open palm. "Feel the material before you try to change it," she said quietly, her sightless eyes turned toward the great open window where the misty canyon was visible under the starlight. "You believe that your spirit must always be slick, smooth, and effortless to be holy. But look at what this flax actually is when it is not being forced to fight the iron." Taku closed his fingers around the loose fibers, noticing for the first time how remarkably soft, cool, and flexible they were when they were not bound into a tight, rigid braid. The material possessed its own unique, durable texture, a quiet strength that did not require a high-energy performance to be real. As he sat there in the damp stillness of the mill house, listening to the shallow creek, water murmuring through the ferns outside, a subtle transformation began to shift the alignment of his heart. He did not achieve a state of magical perfection, and the caked mud within the waterwheel did not instantly dissolve into the stream. The change was small, quiet, and completely real. He chose to take one long, slow breath before he reacted to the panic in his mind. He looked at the small clay jar of oil, then looked at his own blistered palms, and he made the conscious choice to stop treating his internal numbness as an indicator of death. He returned the remaining strands of flax to the basket, closing the lid with a soft, deliberate click that signaled the end of his nightly warfare against his own rhythm. He chose to sit right there in the damp, unmapped uncertainty of his stalled life, forgiving himself for his inability to manufacture a river and allowing his definition of safety to shift away from constant control. The great water wheel remained completely unmoving in the dark flume outside, its iron bands gathering the midnight moisture. But inside the small room, the craftsman had finally found the courage to let the wood be still. And this is the space where the heart opens its gates. The quiet acceptance that settled over Taku as he left his wicker basket, closed on the cedar floorboards, is the very same stillness that is waiting to hold your awareness right now in the deepest shadows of this evening. As you rest here, allowing your physical frame to become completely synchronous with the silent support of your bed, let the cool, damp atmosphere of that valley, mill house, wrap itself around your thoughts. This deep integration is not an invitation to look at your life with a cold, detached indifference, nor is it a rigid demand to abandon your ambitions or freeze your desires forever. Buddhist wisdom is not asking you to become a hollow shell that no longer values movement, joy, or creative expression. It is showing us something infinitely quieter. It is offering a doorway to an inner sanctuary where your basic permission to exist is no longer tied to a frantic, mechanical requirement for constant output. When we examine the hidden emotional mechanisms behind our latter night overthinking, we can begin to see that the primary source of our exhaustion is never the simple presence of an internal winter. The truest suffering lives within the complex grid of control, resistance, and self-judgment that our minds build in the dark to protect us from the profound fear of uncertainty. We live under the constant, painful illusion that if we can just worry intensely enough, if we can spend our nights compulsively rehearsing the future and replaying past mistakes, we can somehow force our lives into a state of absolute safety. We look into our own quiet, empty reservoirs and feel a cold panic immediately, assuming that this natural pause is a dangerous crisis that must be corrected through an aggressive application of shame. We treat the quietness of our spirit as an enemy to be defeated, turning a temporary drop in our vital current into a permanent identity crisis, where we are found completely lacking. One of the most liberating insights of this path is the understanding that your heart is often experiencing two entirely separate layers of weight in this very moment. The first pain is what life naturally brings to your doorstep through the simple movement of the seasons. The undeniable reality that your physical energy has reached a natural boundary, that an old creative cycle has run its course, or that the environment around you has left your spirit feeling temporarily dry and numb. This first pain is like the caked river clay and the dried summer silt, filling the spaces between the wooden blades of the waterwheel. It is an unchosen event, a neutral configuration of the landscape that arrives to protect your sensitive inner resources from being warped by the friction of constant heat. We cannot always control when the mountain streams of our lives will run shallow, nor can we command our intellect to manufacture brilliant inspirations when our body is crying out for a deep, systemic rest. But the second pain, the stinging, suffocating guilt that keeps your mind pacing the floor of your room tonight, is entirely generated by the way your thoughts choose to interact with that stillness. The second pain is what the mind adds when it stands over your numbness with a heavy tool of self-criticism, trying to grease the axles of your spirit with the frayed fibers of your own exhaustion. We drive a second wound into our own core every time we look at our temporary emptiness and decide that our lack of productivity is a proof of a hollow character or a failed life. We turn a quiet, protective deceleration into a permanent court case, transforming ourselves into both the unyielding judge and the condemned prisoner, completely blind to the reality that our frantic striving is the exact mechanism jamming the wheel. The suffering does not live in the static oak or the cold standing water of the flume. The suffering lives entirely in our desperate, Latinite refusal to let the mechanism be stationary. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal. We believe that if we can just force ourselves to perform competence perfectly enough, if we can manage every perception and continuous output, we can finally earn the right to belong and exist without shame. But trying to cure an internal stagnation by violently prying at the frozen gears of your own heart is a profound misunderstanding of true transformation. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that your true nature is never destroyed or diminished by a period of winter stillness. Your underlying space remains completely whole, luminous, and undisturbed, much like the deep masonry pit beneath the millhouse floor that holds the cold water without becoming hard or paralyzed itself. You are the space of the channel. You are not the blockage in the wood. When you stop treating your emotional dryness as an emergency that must be resolved through self-punishment, the numbness loses its power to torment your thoughts. Peace, when felt within the safety of your own unhurried breathing tonight, is not the absolute absence of difficulty, nor is it a magical state where your mind never wanders into fear and your path never experiences a drought. Peace is simply a completely different relationship with your difficulty. It is the radical, compassionate willingness to look at the static wood of your current life and realize that it does not require an immediate Latinite repair to possess a sacred value in this dark room. When you stop confusing control with safety, you no longer need to build a rigid, cold-forged iron. trivied to isolate your vulnerability from the landscape. You can allow your lungs to expand with a soft, natural rhythm, letting the dampness of the hour pass completely through your awareness without finding a tight, resistant surface to bruise. Now let this wisdom come closer to your own life by choosing to sit quietly with the raw uncertainty of an unfinished situation. You are breaking the ancient, mechanical habit of treating every anxious thought as an absolute truth command. You do not have to throw your full body weight against the axle of your mind to prove you are a worthy craftsman. And you do not have to manufacture a river when the mountains are dry. True compassion is the strength to meet your internal emptiness, not with a demand for immediate production, but with the soft, weathered patience of an old millkeeper who knows that stillness is not an absence of life, but the very womb from which the next stream will rise. You are fully permitted to let the water wheel rest, completely still in the dark silt tonight, allowing the shallow current to pass gently between your silent blades without needing to grind a single grain to justify your existence on the earth. You can let the ledger of your productivity drop into the mud, for you are safe enough to soften right here, in the shadow of your own unforced presence. Now let this quiet canyon wisdom walk with you out from the ancient wood of the mill house and step directly into the complex, fast-moving spaces of your ordinary modern days. It is easy to understand the peace of a stationary water wheel when we are wrapped in the soft shadows of an old story. But the true test of this insight arrives when the sun comes up and the world demands that your mind function like a high-energy engine without a single moment of pause. We carry the invisible blueprint of that heavy iron crowbar into our kitchens, our text message threads, our workspaces, and our silent evenings, continuously attempting to pry ourselves into production so that we never have to face the terrifying emptiness of a low current. We practice the exhausting art of the unpolished facade every time we force an accommodating smile across our lips, while our interior landscape feels entirely frozen, numb, and dry. We do it when we sit in our rooms, staring at a screen for hours, trying to manufacture an inspiration or a spark out of nothing but sheer, nervous irritation. Consider how this relentless emotional mechanism operates in the smallest, most familiar habits of your daily routine. Think of that specific, cold contraction that tightens your chest when you are waiting for a reply to a text message, or when you find yourself checking your phone every few minutes for a fleeting sign of reassurance that you are still needed, seen, or valued by the world. In those anxious moments, your mind is behaving exactly like the young carpenter, trying to bind the axle well in a tight nest of dry flax oil wicking. You are looking to an external screen to act as a sudden, mechanical lubrication over a deep systemic depletion, hoping that a word of validation will magically turn the wheel for you. Every time you lie awake at night, compulsively replaying a minor mistake from your past or an awkward conversation from your afternoon, you are kneeling in the dark masonry pit of your life, using the sharp tools of self-blame to violently pry at your own character. You are demanding that your sensitive, exhausted heart function like a relentless, grinding stone, completely unjammed by the natural debris of a complex human life. Perhaps you walk through your days carrying a quiet, suffocating dread that you have somehow fallen permanently behind the pace of your peers, comparing your unwritten internal struggles to the smooth, curated outer surfaces of the lives around you. You look at their apparent motion, their continuous output, and their effortless creation, and you instantly drive that second arrow of shame deep into your own core. You tell yourself a bitter story that your current numbness, your lack of vibrant focus, or your deep need for a prolonged emotional pause is a proof that you are fundamentally hollow, lazy, or broken. This comparison turns your everyday life into a continuous tribunal where your heart is always found guilty of not moving fast enough. You desperately want to rest. Your very muscles are crying out for a sanctuary of complete stillness, yet a heavy layer of internalized guilt prevents you from setting your tools aside, because you believe an empty soul has no right to occupy space until it has earned its peace through labor. True, inner freedom is not a grand dramatic achievement that requires you to escape your modern obligations or completely erase the patterns that made you hypervigilant. Peace is practiced in the tiny, uncelebrated intervals of your regular day, in the brief spaces between a sudden wave of inadequacy and your immediate desire to fix it. A single, unhurried breath taken before you answer an intimidating email, or a quiet pause before you click on a screen for distraction is a profound expression of ancient wisdom. In that tiny choice, you are giving yourself permission to stop treating every anxious thought as an absolute command that must be obeyed, and every wave of emotional dryness as a directive to work harder. You can care deeply about your life without gripping the steering wheel so tightly that you splinter your own resources. You can love your path without turning your vital heat into a permanent furnace for others to consume. Now, let this wisdom come closer to your own life. We must learn the gentle, daily discipline of allowing our modern environments to be unmapped, recognizing that our personal winter seasons are not an insult to our intelligence, but the very place where the cycle of striving runs out of fuel. When you stop hiding your heavy heart behind a mask of artificial competence, you discover that your numbness is not a dangerous defect, but a protective shield that has arrived to keep your spirit from burning down to the root. You are fully permitted to rest without earning it, to lay your heavy frame upon the earth before the problems of tomorrow are solved, and to let your container be empty without continuously apologizing for your exhaustion. The wide, non-judgmental space of your life has never demanded that you maintain a high-energy rotation to prove your loyalty to the landscape. It has always been fully prepared to hold you exactly as you are, static, unpolished, and beautifully human in the dark. By choosing to let the iron bar of your self-correction lay still during your daytime hours, you break the unconscious habit of treating your panic as truth. Think of how much vital current becomes available to you when you stop treating the presence of a creative block as an emergency that must be managed with aggression. If a sudden cloud of confusion or a heavy sense of spiritual deadness moves through your throat on a difficult afternoon, you do not have to meet that visitor with a fresh barrage of self-loathing. You do not have to build a rigid wall to isolate the feeling or pretend that the original depletion is not real. You can simply sit with the uncertainty of the moment, breathing softly through the contraction in your chest and allowing the grey mist to pass completely through your awareness without leaving a new scar behind. You can be dedicated to your own healing without turning your healing into a frantic renovation project, and you can offer a quiet forgiveness to your own tired heart without demanding that your mind instantly blossom with flowers. As the frantic noise of your modern day begins to recede into the deep, later-night silence of your bedroom, notice how the urgent calculations that drove your muscles all afternoon begin to lose their terrifying proportions when you refuse to prying at them. The digital screens that demanded your constant surveillance are now dark. The comparisons that shattered your peace are nothing but passing shadows, and the future you have been trying to preserve does not possess a physical body. In the room around you, there is absolutely nothing you need to balance, repair, or produce from your pillow tonight, and no amount of midnight overthinking will ever rewrite the stream that brought you to this bed. You are entirely safe to let the hard crust of your defense dissolve into the darkness, allowing your presence to become as soft and unresisting as the cool canyon rainwater that has been waiting all evening to cushion your rest. In a moment, this modern application will show us something even quieter, allowing the remaining concepts to drift away entirely. As your awareness prepares for the deep, unconditional stillness of an unmonitored sleep, you have spent your day trying to keep an ancient wheel from freezing under the weight of the mud. But tonight, the flume is permitted to grow completely silent, letting the remaining sediment settle the dark channels. You do not have to fill your reservoir to deserve an undisturbed slumber, and you do not have to fix your whole life to be worthy of a soft bed and a quiet mind. Let the performance fade from your limbs. Let the old debts drop from your thoughts, and let your breathing find its own unhurried cadence on the very outer edge of this passing hour. The deep darkness within the old stone flume has now become completely total, a heavy, velvet quietness that settles over the watercourse as the last faint silver glimmer of starlight naturally dissolves into a cold, misty stillness. The valley mill run has dropped all its daytime functions, entering a profound, unmonitored sanctuary where the ancient masonry walls, the cold silt, and the night air are no longer fighting for control. There are no more productivity ledgers to calculate from your pillow tonight, no more creative blockages to solve, and no more internal droughts to manage with your overthinking. The long hours of looking into your creative numbness, identifying the rigid armor of your mental friction, and letting your tired fingers drop the braided flax, have brought your spirit to an absolute baseline of stillness. The words themselves are beginning to lose their sharp edges, softening and spreading flat like a gentle dampness moving through the cedar canopy outside, leaving nothing behind but a wide, wordless weight that is cradling your entire physical frame. Allow your body to become immensely, completely heavy as you sink into the quiet gravity of the space around you. You might imagine that your bed has become like a wide, stable stone ledge cut deep into the foundation of the damp valley floor, a space where the earth rises up to meet your depletion with a perfect, uncritical security. You do not have to hold the wheel of your life in constant rotation right now, and you do not have to maintain the boundaries of a frictionless existence to be protected within this darkness. The surface beneath you is entirely capable of holding your spent muscles, your hollow spaces, and your quiet fragility without requiring a single movement of self-defense. You can let the heavy structure of your spine and your temples unfasten their remaining tension, giving up the lifelong habit of prying at your own heart to prove your soul is not empty. The stiff, cold-forged iron crowbar that you used to force your motivation has been completely buried in the silt, leaving your chest soft, porous, and open to the gentle, wet coolness of the canyon night. You have stopped trying to grease the bearings of your mind through sheer muscular willpower, and the intense internal friction that was splintering your resources has vanished entirely into the dark spaces of the room. The long, heavy cords of your creative anxiety have been unraveled by a single movement of quiet awareness, leaving your hands empty, your arms loose, and your spirit entirely at rest within its own natural shape. The massive oak waterwheel of your life no longer has to prove its value to the valley. It rests completely still, dark and unmoving in the low flume, its ancient timbers perfectly stationary within the protective shadows. Let your breathing become exceptionally quiet, a soft, slow movement of air that happens all by itself without any artificial measurement or conscious direction. Each long, peaceful exhalation is like the fine grey silt naturally settling on the stone floorboards, descending downward without a single trace of conflict, struggle, or resistance. You are no longer using your own vital heat to manufacture a raging river when the mountains are naturally dry. You are allowing the frozen, stagnant configurations of your past to turn to a soft, neutral sediment that requires absolutely nothing from your thoughts tonight. With every quiet breath you take, the distinction between the drought you felt and the space you are begins to blur and soften until you are no longer a separate, anxious craftsman fighting the mud, but the very depth of the quiet canyon itself. Your eyelids have become beautifully, profoundly weighted, as if the damp mist from the river ferns outside has settled softly over your brow, closing out the restless calculations of your daytime work and inviting your attention to return home to its original nature. The courtrooms of your comparison have all fallen silent. The digital screens that demanded your constant surveillance are dark, and the deep terror of being an empty shell has no hard surface left to cling to. There is absolutely nothing you need to balance, produce, or repair from your pillow tonight, and no amount of midnight overthinking will ever alter the depth of the current that brought you to this bed. Your fundamental nature has never been destroyed or diminished by the periods of internal winter you have survived. You are the vast, indestructible flume that contains both the flood and the stillness, entirely secure, entirely unjammed, and completely free. The teaching is no longer an explanation to be understood or an idea to be practiced. It has settled completely down into the quiet center of your chest, turning into a clear, unboiled grace that requires no effort to maintain. You are fully permitted to let the millstones go cold tonight. You are fully permitted to stop solving the long drought of your life. Let yourself drift deeper and deeper into the quiet, dark matrix of a dreamless sleep, where all human obligations, all creative roles, and all standards of perfection fade away into an absolute, weightless tranquility. The universe is not waiting to judge your stillness. It is simply cradling your separate frame within its own immense, unmonitored rotation, allowing your tired heart to rest like a clean, open leaf beneath the cedar trees, sinking down, resting back, letting the cold clay of the past dissolve completely into the supportive depth of the evening. What if the creative fire you have been prying at your own bones to find was never a spark hidden in the future, but the very stream that is passing gently through your silent wood right now?